Well, welcome to my presentation about channel theory. Before I get started into that, I just want to take a moment to thank my lineage of teachers, Shiatsu teachers. I just want to thank my first two teachers, Barbara Escher and Rosemary Scavulo Flickinger, for getting me started on this path. And then soon after, introducing me to Pauline Sasaki, who I give much gratitude to. I studied with Pauline over about a 14-year period of time, and I'm really grateful for her presence and her teaching and all that it revealed in my touch in the time that I studied with her. I also want to give a special thanks to Winter Jade. She has been a great inspiration to me and has assisted me at times with my teaching work. And I'm most appreciative for her support and her encouragement. And I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Ed Neal, whose translation work I'm going to be presenting today, who I've been currently studying with. And you'll learn more about him in just a moment. And finally, I'd just like to thank the ancestors that have really seeded the transmission of this teaching about the channels, and particularly the Neijing. And so let's get started. So Dr. Neal, Dr. Edward Neal, I also want to thank him for lending me a lot of the slides I'm going to use in this PowerPoint. Dr. Neal is both a Western trained physician and also a Chinese medical trained physician, and he has devoted the last 20 years of his career to learning classical Chinese and retranslating the Neijing to really get to the root of the original teaching about channel theory, and particularly as a foundation knowledge for acupuncture, but it also translates to all kinds of body work treatments to the body. And so mostly what I'm going to be sharing today are the ideas I've learned through Dr. Neal's translations and his teaching work about how channel theory was developed originally and the kind of therapies that it produced. If you want to learn more about Dr. Neal, I'll recommend going to his website, neijingstudies.com. You can find some videos there to watch. You can also find quite a few articles he's written on this subject that I really recommend reading. It'll give you a little bit more elaboration than what we have time for today. I'm going to focus mostly today on just some original ideas about the channel system. And they all start in this classical text called the Huangdi Neijing, translated as the Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic. You may have learned about this text in your education at some point, particularly if you're learning about the history of Chinese medicine. This is one of the oldest texts about channel theory and particularly about acupuncture, but it's a critical text. It's really a foundational text for East Asian medicine, and it's complex and it's rich with information. It really provides a single unified theory about the basic principles and patterns of motion in the cosmos, and within that cosmos, particularly the human body. And it describes the human body in both its condition of health and illness, and it really lays out a clinical methodology for restoring the ecology of the human being and supporting our human flourishing. So very critical text. But it has been not always clearly translated. It has often been thought as somewhat obscure. But in recent decades, there's been a lot of advancement in translation technology of classical Chinese language, written language. And with those newer technologies, we've been able to get a clearer understanding of what the Neijing is conveying. And this is what Dr. Neil has devoted his time to, and why I chose to study with him, because it's been a quest of mine throughout my 30-year career as an Asian bodywork therapist to really get a better understanding of just what the channel network is, and what its origin is. I've been searching for those answers for a while, and I'm quite excited to have found a lot of answer to those questions through Dr. Neil's work. So in the Neijing, it all begins with the Tao, as all things Chinese do. And for the sake of our medical discussion, we just define the Tao as the way of nature's motions. And the Tao gives us the celestial bodies, heaven, and it gives us the terrestrial body, the earth. Between these two bodies, we have the experience of qi. Qi is a difficult word to translate into English. We often just translate it as energy or life force. But when you really get into the Neijing, the meaning of qi is really fleshed out quite a bit. And it really signifies in the Neijing the fabric of space-time motion. The qi is really, the meaning of qi is really constructed as something both tangible and intangible, something physical and subtle. But you can sort of think of it as a tissue that's endless in space and time, and unified as a singular body. And as a tissue, it undulates, it oscillates, and it expands and it contracts. And this is what gives us the qualities of yin and yang as phases of motion. So qi is also translated as the breath of the universe. And by breath, what is really signified is this cyclical motion of expanding and returning, expanding and contracting. So we get this yin-yang motioning that we associate with the meaning of qi. And that motioning creates all the wave patterns of the cosmos and of our experience here upon the earth as a body. The Neijing really goes into quite a lot of detail about how nature uses the breath motion of yin and yang and the power of the sun and the passage and cycles of seasons to weave the world in which we live. These patterns are marked by cyclical patterns of opening and closing and rising and falling that make up our experience, our terrestrial experience on the earth. And upon these motions, nature weaves the world using both a warp and weft pattern. We're going to get into this in a little bit more detail in a moment, but it's our terrestrial experience on the earth that gives us these motions of opening and closing. The image you can think of here is just the way a flower opens in the sunlight and closes at night. So because our earth orbits around a sun, we have a particular cyclical pattern of opening and closing. And that opening, closing, and ascending and descending pattern that's created through that unique relationship between the earth and the sun generates all the base patterns on our planet. And these patterns start to weave together to create a unique patterning that actually creates what in a moment you'll see are the channels in the body. So this image of a weaving can be helpful to us. The Neijing uses this image a lot. There's also a term in the Neijing called the qi jiao. The qi jiao, translated as a qi interchange, is signifying this weaving. The qi jiao is the way these motion patterns of opening and closing, rising and falling, weave together to make the whole biosphere of our planet, and its weather patterns and its growth patterns, and the patterns upon which all living forms are structured. And so this weaving motion, as a result of this unique relationship between the earth and the sun, is what creates the channels. So what are the channels according to the Neijing? The word in the Neijing for the channels is Jing Lo. Jing Lo refers to these axial and radial patterns that get constellated in the Earth's terrain. And we see this axial and radial relationship patterned in all kinds of forms upon Earth. We see it in riverbeds, we see it in trees, plant forms. It's a fractal pattern, right? We can see it in the tree in its larger scale, but then as we break it down, we look into the leaf of a tree, we see that same patterning happening on a smaller scale. And we see it happening in the body with the blood vessels, right down to the capillary bed, moving from larger vessels to smaller vessels to even micro size vessels. But the patterning is same, this axial and radial patterning. But that patterning makes up the entire matrix of blood vessels in the body, just like it does with riverbeds in the Earth's terrain. So to weave these patterns, nature first sets the vertical threads of the warp patterns, like the warp of a loom. And in the Neijing, these are called axial patterns, or jing. They provide the structure and orientation that is set by the position and influence of the sun. So we have this idea of a loom, nature's loom. We have this rising and falling, ascending, descending pattern in this axis between the earth and the celestial bodies, in particular our sun. And these warp patterns are set first. They provide a structure and orientation for the axial pattern. For the radial patterns. So just like on a loom, we have the warp that's laid down first. And then we have the axial pattern. This is like the warp thread of a loom. This classical term also refers to a guiding principle or a classical text. I think I got myself confused. I'm still talking about axial patterns. And you can see in this character that the axial patterning also makes reference to water channels. It refers to a loom, but it also refers to water channels or underground rivers. This idea of underground rivers is going to become really important in terms of understanding the channels in the bodies. The radical on the left, which is silk threads, we often see that radical on classical characters to suggest that we're talking about a pattern that's pervasive through the whole cosmos, as opposed to just a localized pattern. In nature, these axial patterns are seen mostly in vertical structures that stretch between heaven and earth in a direct line, and this is why they have a yang directional quality. Trees are a great example of this. When you look at the tree trunk, it has a vertical, reaching upward from the ground to the sky in its relationship to gravity, and has a strong axial pattern. Next, we have the horizontal threads, or the weft pattern on a loom. And in the Neijing, these are called radial collateral patterns, or low. And they provide more of the texture and the complexity and all the beauty and variation of forms. So just like on a loom, where we have the axial patterning creating the warp, the weft pattern moves horizontally and weaves itself in between the warp to create all this texture and give the feeling of a net or a mesh. When we look at this character, the character for low, we have that silk threads radical on the left, again signifying that this is a cosmic pattern. And on the right, this radical suggests threads or a web or a net that encircle or envelop. In nature, we see these patterns in complex branching structures that extend laterally from the midline. And those patterns have more of a yin or a transitional quality. So unlike a tree trunk, if we look at a vine that's spreading, it spreads more horizontally and creeps along the surface of the earth rather than reaching upward towards the sun. And so here we see this yin-yang relationship and the Jing-Lo patterning of form. But within these two patterns, the Neijing explains to us that nature creates all the various structures of the living forms of the world from just the interaction of these two patterns. So again, we look at riverbeds and their patterning. We see this Jing-Lo patterning, axial radial patterning. We see it in the trees. We can see it in the skeletal structure of our body, the spine having an axial directional pattern and the ribs radiating off that central axial pattern. We see it in the blood vessel of our bodies with these more vertical, longitudinal, larger vessels. And then we have all these branching vessels off to the side. And they would be this. So this would be the vertical vessels would be Jing, a Jing pattern. And the branching blood vessels would be a Lo pattern. So the Neijing articulates that because the living structures in nature develop in environments characterized by this oscillating cyclical motion of rising and falling, opening and closing, along these basic principles, they must create what the Neijing refers to as graining passageways to carry the circulations that move within these patterns. So in the Neijing, we get this term called Li. And Li is signifying this inherent informing pattern or principle. And it's called a graining. And by graining, we're really looking at the way form structures itself, where we have, if you look at these rolling hills, you see these kind of little valleys in between. So we have peaks and valleys. And this is the graining pattern that gets described in the Neijing, that when we look at the surface of the earth, we see this kind of undulation, this oscillating pattern inherent in all kinds of form. So we see it across the landscape. Here we can see it in a body of sand. By the way, the wind and water circulate through that form, creating these peaks and valleys. Here we see it in the surface of the skin, the same kind of graining pattern or grooving, if you want to use another word. Here we see this graining pattern in marble and stone. Here's the graining pattern in a big stump of wood. This is the graining pattern of the fascia, connective tissue in the body. And in the theories of the Neijing, these indiscernible patterns of space-time motion become tangible manifestations of form through this process that's called pattern graining. And this process includes both intangible processes of motion that comprise the majority of the unseen universe, but it as well as the tangible patterns of form that arise within the physical structures of nature and the human body. So there is an intangible force that's being transmitted almost like musical vibration from the heavens above, from the celestial bodies that constitute what we observe as physical form here on Earth, generating these patterns. I put these slides in here to give you an example of what this might look like. This is called a Chladni plate that was developed by a person with the name Chladni. And what this is a metal plate, and it has sand on it, and vibrational frequencies are transmitted into that plate. And as you change the frequency patterns of vibration, you'll get different configurations of sand. Where you see the white sand, this is where the resonance stops, where there's no movement. So all the spaces in between that you're seeing as black is a resonant space where motion is circulating. And each time you change the frequency, you get a very different pattern. This is a great example of the relationship between our stars and our heavenly bodies and the Earth. The stars are creating all kinds of forces, vibrational forces that we can't see, but actually shape the way structures emerge and form themselves here on Earth, which we do see. When you look at this pattern here, you can almost think of this as try visualizing this as a cross-section of tubes or vessels running through the body that have fluid circulating through them. And this is how nature, through its vibrational relationships, creates form. All of this is suggested and articulated in this foundational text, the Neijing, which is quite remarkable. In their creation, all tangible forms of nature create passageways to allow patterns of space-time motion, which we call qi, to circulate. This process creates both empty spaces in the form through which motions circulate, and a tangible aspect of form that maintains the shape of this space. So it's sort of motion in form. Right, so we look at this nature's graining patterns again, and those sort of peaks and valleys give us a form and a space in between. Again, just like a river, right? The river bed is the form created by that graining pattern. And the space in between becomes a resonant space for something in motion. In this case, water. All physical forms in the universe, including all aspects of nature and the human body, exist as tangible expressions of motion and form, and that are sustained second by second by these intangible patterns of circulation upon which they were created. So on Earth, we do not see these patterns of motion directly that are being transmitted, but we do see them in the tangible aspects of climate and the forms of nature and the circulations of water or bodies of water. In Neijing nature-based medicine, all the physical structures in the universe arise in ways to maximize the ease and efficiency of the indiscernible patterns of space-time motion circulating in their environment at the time of their creation and continued evolution. This principle confers to the universe a quality of circulatory intelligence. It is an important factor in both the process and evolution and clinical practice that's articulated as a methodology in the Neijing. So the Neijing is very much about this wisdom of circulatory intelligence that pervades the cosmos and nature and the human body. And so it gives us this whole notion of Jinglo, which is these axial and radial patterns making up the physical structures of the earth and the forms on the earth, including our human form. So these yin-yang breath patterns of the cosmos being like music, like the resonant vibrational fields of the celestial bodies, infuse our terrestrial world and pattern all its manifestations. We get this base pattern of axial graining pattern and radial graining pattern, the Jing Lo, creating all this structure and creating the space in between that allows for the circulation of fluids. So in the landscape, we have rivers, axial and graining patterns creating river bodies. And these in the Neijing are called Jing Shui. But those same axial and graining patterns circulating fluid in the body are called Jing Mai and Lo Mai. And here they are. So the Neijing is describing the blood vessel system in the body as an intricate flow of river channels patterned on this axial and radial graining pattern motion. So this is why the channels in the body are called the Jing Lo. There's this interplay of axial and radial circulatory pattern of fluids in the body, in particular blood. In the Neijing, the primary bodies of water in nature are called Jing Shui, or axial waters. Here's the character for Jing Shui, which means channel waters. And then when the Neijing refers to the body, he'll use a different term, which we'll get to in a moment. But here's a picture of a canyon, again with the kind of groove between two banks, which creates a space for water to channel through. And again, we see this pattern of axial graining, and radial graining would be like the tributaries and distributaries branching off of that main river channel. Within the body, rivers flow within underground passageways. In the Neijing, these passageways are called axial channel tunnels, Jing Shui. Go back one. So we have a different character that refers to these axial channels being tunnels. like underground rivers. So it's still making reference to the circulatory pattern, but now placing it underground. Underground rivers flowing along longitudinal axial patterns are called axial channel rivers, jingmai, and those flowing in lateral or radial patterns are called radial collateral rivers, lomai. So the Neijing then introduces these new terms of jingmai and lomai, still making reference to the axial and radial graining patterns that pervade all of nature, but now moving it into the human form and using this term mai. Mai is a classical term for blood vessel, but it also signifies a subterranean river or a pulse, right? A motioning underground. And this is the way the blood vessels are seen in the body as jingmai, axial channel rivers, and lomai, radial collateral rivers flowing underground. Here's some passages from the Neijing, which I'll just read to you. Mai signifies the patterns, li, and divisions of the blood that flow through the graining spaces of the body. The channel rivers, mai, are the official residents of the blood. Thus, it is possible to diagnose the body by examining the course of the channel rivers, mai, and assessing their various condition of stirring and stillness. And so here we begin to see the ideas of clinical methodology in the Neijing. These channel rivers, these underground rivers within the body's flesh, can be examined. They're examined visually and they're examined through palpation to determine how they're moving or not moving or how they're obstructed. And so historically, we went from this idea of underground rivers and blood vessels in the body to this, which today we call meridians. And we have a lot of derivative ideas about what the meridians are on the body, in the body. But the way we think about them today and learn them today is not quite like what was originally described in the foundational text of the Neijing, which I find absolutely exciting and fascinating to have clarified and to consider. So in the original terminology, the terms jing and lo refer to specific types of graining patterns or riverbeds, while the term mai signifies that those graining patterns in question carry blood river within their banks. So the jingmai and lomai patterns of circulation in the body were perceived the same as the riverbed patterns that constitute watershed regions in the Earth's terrain. What is a watershed? Well, a watershed is the way that river flow starts to infuse itself into the land that embodies that river flow. A watershed is an ecological area in which all of the water within its domain drains and flows to the same place. That area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common water course. I particularly like this passage for helping us to appreciate the ecology of a watershed. What's unique about this concept is the Neijing describes the body's tissue regions as a watershed, just like what we experience in our environment around us and the Earth's terrain. And the Neijing divides the body's terrain into 12 watershed tissue regions. Today, we call them energy pathways, or we call them meridians. but in the original teaching in the Neijing, they were 12 primary watersheds, and they had the names of Taiyin, Yangming, Shaoyin, Taiyang, Zhuiyin, Shaoyang. I may have skipped a few. Let me go through that again. There's the Taiyin, Shaoyin, Zhuiyin, Yangming, Taiyang, Shaoyang. There we go. These are the 12 watershed regions of the body. And in the Neijing, they're actually associated with 12 rivers in China. These correspondences are important because they were associated or corresponded with these 12 different rivers in China because it was to show how the flow quality of that river in the Earth's terrain was similar to the flow quality within the body's terrain. So the Neijing gives quite a bit of description of these correspondences between the properties and features of these actual rivers in the land and how they help us understand a similar flow quality of circulation within the body. Just to summarize a little bit, so the Neijing medicine that's articulated in the Neijing is based on a very complex description of the body's three-dimensional blood circulation, which is referred to as the Jingmai and Lomai. And the therapeutics in the Neijing are all based on principles about restoring this fluid circulation within the body. The Neijing descriptions, the external aspects of the body, are divided into those 12 watershed regions, which we call today the meridians, and they're each defined by a path of a centrally flowing Mai River and a lot of branching vessels off that central river. Mai rivers correlate to our Western idea of blood vessels, but there are a lot of important differences in the Neijing that articulates a lot of those differences. One feature that's unique in the Neijing teaching is discussion about how that blood river in the body is also circulating the light of our star, the sun, circulating the light of the heavens, which becomes a force within the body's circulatory system, as well as the nutritive force of the blood, brings a really exquisite coherence and intelligence into the body. The clinical methodology that's laid out in the Neijing, which Dr. Neal has really done a good job of re-articulating for us, the acupuncture methodology articulated in the Neijing is really very much a surgical procedure where needling is used to manipulate and restore tissue planes like riverbeds to open spaces for restoring river flows. And this is really thought of as sort of an ecological restoration of watersheds, which are all the body's tissue regions that envelop all this blood and fluid circulation. So those correspondences between rivers in the land and rivers in the body mean that the same celestial resonant graining pattern that form those primary bodies of water in nature create the corresponding aspects of blood circulation within the human body. All right, so if the channels are blood and fluid circulation patterns, then what are the acupoints? Okay, so, all right, if the channels were actually blood and fluid circulation patterns, blood vessels, Then what then are acupoints? Well, it's interesting. In the Neijing text, there are no acupoints, at least not the way we learn them today. The Neijing does not contain any mention of acupuncture points. Instead, it describes a variety of diverse ecological regions and features and names for those features according to their local qualities. In Neijing nature-based medicine, these areas are called named regions, and translations they are indicated by the use of capital letters. They indicate to the reader an area of special importance. So pay special attention to these areas and work to deepen your understanding and knowledge of these regions. In some, but not all, of these named regions, surface sinkholes exist that communicate with an underlying blood river. So we'll explore this just for a moment, this idea of a sinkhole connecting us with an underlying blood river. This is really the main idea put forth in the Neijing about what today we think of as acupoints. In the Neijing text, acupuncture point regions are formed by the actions of an underlying blood river and a thinning of the overlying tissues. This creates a surface depression that is called an earth cavern, zhu. All acupuncture point regions belong first to this category. So the character in the Neijing for zhu is suggesting a subterranean cavern, like a cavity cut in rock or through rock. This is a passage from the Neijing that says zhu means an earth chamber, xu. And this character for xu is an inner chamber or a room or a cell, like a pit or a tomb. So it's an enclosed space within. Something like this. Think of a cavern underneath the surface of the earth with an opening that allows us to enter into that space. In nature, acupuncture point regions correspond closely to sinkholes or depressions in the earth formed by a thinning of the underlying soil that overlays a deeper subterranean river. In nature, sinkholes form overflowing rivers. In the body, they develop over blood rivers, jingmai. There's an image of a sinkhole, depression in the earth. And that depression is being generated by the relationship with circulation of water underneath. Here we have that entrance into a cavern. It might bring us into a space like this where we have an underground river flowing through a chamber. This means that originally there was a one-to-one correlation between blood vessels and acupuncture point regions. Over time, this relationship has changed, and the importance of blood circulation has been diminished in the theory. In the original Neijing descriptions, earth cavern regions, which we know today as acupuncture point regions, were named after unique ecological features found in their location in a very straightforward way. And none of these names possessed any elaborate or hidden or magical or esoteric meanings that had to be discerned. So they were what we have come to know today as acupuncture points in the Neijing were just described as unique places on the surface of the body where you could find depressions, where you could have access to those underground river flows, that underground blood vessel circulation, and affect its circulatory pattern. Those regions in the Neijing are described as places where you could palpate the pulse or some quality about the river flow. There are areas that they might be special areas that tend to get stagnant or create obstruction. And in those special regions, you can clear that obstruction to ease the flow or restore the flow of a certain pattern of circulation. Those regions in the Neijing are also described as places where you can affect distal locations. Like it indicates a tensegrity in the body such that, from one location you could affect another location. That's also described in the Neijing. But there's no point action theory in the Neijing. This is something that developed much later. In the Neijing, you just get descriptions of tissue regions where you could have some special or unique influence upon the whole riverbed system within the body, its whole flow pattern. I found this particularly exciting to learn when studying these translations of the Neijing with respect to Masanaga's teaching, because he de-emphasized the acupoints on the body and really created a methodology that guides us to palpate the entire length of the channel and actually feel for tissue changes along that trajectory that we call empty and full. And in the Neijing, you get a description of what this means clinically, to palpate for empty and fullness in the watershed regions of the body, in that trajectory. So Masanaga's methodology very much matches this idea in the Neijing. I have no way of knowing if he had access to this kind of translated meaning from the Neijing, but I found it really fascinating that his methodology matches quite well some of these ideas in the Neijing. So in any case, I want to thank you for attending. I invite you to more conversation about how the Neijing approach to channel theory can really increase the efficacy of our medicine and our touch medicine. The Neijing is rich with description and suggestion about how to interact with the body circulatory network and blood vessel flow. Since studying with Dr. Neil, I've been relearning blood vessel anatomy of the body. It's been quite interesting to change my lens to looking at blood vessel flow and also really appreciating the vibrational qualities in the environment around us and in the body itself that pattern those flows. So studying with Dr. Neil has really helped me integrate a lot of my previous training regarding subtle perception and really joining it with a much more physical palpation of the body. And as I said before, if you want to learn more about what Dr. Neil is up to, I suggest visiting his website, explore there a little bit. I hope that we will cross paths at some point, and I'm happy to join any conversation or answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.